On a bitter winter evening, the world outside was a harsh, unforgiving expanse of snow and emptiness. Orson, a seasoned truck driver, navigated his refrigerated rig through the endless farmland, his mind clouded with the monotony of his journey and the weight of years spent in the same routine. His phone buzzed with an urgent call from his boss, reinforcing the pressure to meet impossible deadlines. The hum of the engine and the solitude of the open road were his constant companions, but tonight, something else was about to pierce the quiet. As snowflakes swirled around him and the temperature dropped, Orson's gaze fell upon an unexpected sight: a young girl, no older than 13, standing alone by the side of the road in nothing but a thin pink dress. Her body shook violently in the cold, and her desperate waves of help seemed out of place in the barren, snow-covered landscape. For a moment, Orson was paralyzed by indecision, his mind racing with reasons to ignore her, to keep driving and finish the delivery. But as he passed her by, guilt gnawed at him, and a part of him knew he couldn't just leave her out there. He made the split-second decision to turn around, setting him on a path that would unravel a web of danger, deception, and the discovery of a courage he never knew he had. The desolate journey begins. The cold winter evening stretched out ahead of Orson like an endless road leading to nowhere. The sky was a solid steel gray, a dreary blanket that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. Snow fell steadily from above, blanketing the fields and the empty highway with a thick, unbroken layer of white. It was the kind of night where everything felt still, save for the gentle hum of the truck's engine, which seemed to push forward against the growing storm. Orson was alone in the cab of his refrigerated truck, the only companion his thoughts, which seemed to spiral into darker places the longer he drove. The road ahead seemed endless, a long ribbon of dark asphalt surrounded by barren farmland on either side. Nothing stirred in the fields, not a single animal or person to be seen. The world outside felt both suffocating and vast, and Orson's mind wandered in sync with the solitude of the drive. His eyes remained fixed on the road, but his mind was far from it. He thought of the years spent behind the wheel, of the miles and miles he had driven without a moment to call his own, all in service of a man who didn't care about him or his life. The truck's dashboard displayed the rapidly falling temperature, -10°C and dropping. Orson had been on the road for hours, and the constant thrum of the engine was the only thing that kept him company. The quiet rhythm of the journey was broken only by the occasional sound of snow hitting the windshield and the gentle scrape of the wipers, which worked tirelessly to clear the falling snow. The familiar routine of driving had long since become second nature to Orson. He had been doing this for 15 years, hauling various loads across the country, sometimes for days at a time. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the biting cold that seemed to penetrate his bones, or the relentless winter storm outside, but the monotony of the road felt heavier tonight, more suffocating. His phone suddenly vibrated against the cup holder, pulling him out of his thoughts. Orson glanced at the screen and saw the name of his boss flash before him, causing a knot to form in his stomach. A call from his boss rarely meant anything good. With a deep sigh, Orson answered the call, bracing himself for the demands he knew were coming. "Orson, we've got 2 urgent deliveries in that cargo you're hauling," his boss's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and impatient. "I need you to step on it, drive faster." Orson felt his grip on the steering wheel tighten. His boss always had a way of making everything sound like an emergency, even if it wasn't. "Yes, sir," Orson replied flatly, already anticipating the next orders. "I'll make sure it gets done." His boss went on, explaining the details of the deliveries. First, there was the usual shipment of fresh produce for the distributors, nothing unusual there. But then came the kicker. Orson's boss emphasized in a tone that left no room for negotiation that the second shipment, wedding flowers, was to be delivered to a special client, the boss's best friend. Orson's heart sank at the mention of the flowers, knowing how important this delivery was to his boss. "I don't care if you have to drive through a blizzard, Orson. Those flowers need to be there on time. Understand?" The sharpness in his boss's voice left no room for excuses. "Yes, sir," Orson replied again, his voice tinged with resignation. He had heard this tone before. His boss's demands were always final, always urgent. He could already feel the weight of the deadline pushing down on him, a pressure that had been building for years, with every late-night phone call, every hurried delivery. As the call ended, Orson leaned back in his seat, a deep sigh escaping his lips. The cab of the truck felt suddenly smaller, more suffocating. His thoughts turned dark as he began to rant to himself, the words spilling out like a floodgate finally breaking open. 15 years of resentment, of lost time, of sacrifices made for a job that never seemed to appreciate him, all came pouring out. 15 years of this, Orson muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel even tighter. Am I the stupidest man alive, or what? He had lost his family, his marriage, all for a job that didn't care whether he lived or died. His mind wandered to the empty future that stretched out before him, imagining himself growing old alone. The thought of dying in this very truck seat, with no one to notice, sent a cold shiver down his spine. Orson couldn't help but feel that he was just another disposable part in the machine, one that could be replaced at any time. The weight of his thoughts grew heavier, and the world outside seemed to darken even further, both physically and mentally. He could almost feel the weight of the storm closing in on him, the pressure of the cargo deadline bearing down on him, and the endless stretch of road that seemed to lead nowhere but into the abyss. But then, just as Orson was sinking further into the abyss of his own thoughts, a small flicker of light appeared in the distance. It was the faint glow of a petrol station, barely visible through the thickening snow. Orson's eyes refocused, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel a brief moment of relief. A stop, a chance to stretch his legs, to grab a cup of coffee, just a small break from the storm. But deep down, Orson knew that relief would be short-lived. The road would always be there, the deadlines, the expectations, and the emptiness. It was the price he had paid for 15 years of driving, and there would be no escape from it. The encounter with the girl in pink. As Orson continued his long, solitary drive through the desolate, snow-covered farmland, the weight of his thoughts and the endless stretch of road started to blur together. The truck's engine hummed steadily, the rhythmic sound almost hypnotic, as the miles ticked away. The snowstorm outside only intensified, the flakes falling thicker and faster, reducing visibility to just a few meters in front of him. The world outside seemed to fade into a white blur, and the only thing Orson could rely on was the road ahead and the guidance of his headlights cutting through the swirling snow. His mind, however, was no longer focused solely on the road. Orson's thoughts lingered on the phone call with his boss. The pressure of the deliveries weighed heavily on him, and the constant reminder of his boss's demanding attitude gnawed at his conscience. His eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of his reflection. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. The same tired face, the same weary eyes that had seen too many miles, too many years spent in a truck, always chasing the next delivery, always under someone else's control. The bitterness he had been carrying for so long seemed to seep out of him like a slow poison. The weight of his regrets and frustrations was so tangible it felt suffocating. He had given up everything for this job, his family, his marriage, his dreams. The truck, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a prison, its cabin a tiny cage in which he spent the majority of his life. The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how hollow his existence had become. Suddenly, a flash of pink caught his eye, standing out against the sea of white. At first, Orson thought it was just a trick of the light, a mere illusion brought on by the heavy snowfall and his own fatigue. But as his truck continued down the highway, the figure took shape, becoming clearer with each passing second. It was a girl, standing alone by the side of the road, no more than 13 years old. She wore nothing but a thin pink dress, barely reaching her knees, and her small body was shaking violently in the brutal cold. Orson's heart skipped a beat as he took in the sight. For a moment, he thought he might be hallucinating, the result of too many hours on the road and the exhaustion beginning to cloud his judgment. But as he drew closer, there was no mistaking it, this was real. The girl was waving frantically, her arms reaching out as if she were begging for help. Orson's foot hovered over the brake pedal, and his heart began to race. The contrast between the child's vulnerability and the harsh, unforgiving landscape around her struck him with an almost physical force. What was she doing out here in the middle of a snowstorm, dressed in nothing but a flimsy dress? The thought alone seemed impossible, yet there she was, clearly in distress. As Orson's truck drew nearer, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? How had she ended up here, all alone? Was this some sort of trap? His instincts as a seasoned driver screamed at him to be cautious, to keep going, not to get involved. It was easy to rationalize staying on course. He had a job to do. The flowers and produce had to be delivered, no matter what. The tight deadlines, the expectations, it all weighed on him like a ton of bricks. "Can't get involved," he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Not my problem. I need to make that delivery." The words came out bitter, almost angry, as if he were trying to convince himself that this was just another distraction he couldn't afford. The girl, her desperate wave, seemed almost like an afterthought. But even as he thought this, something inside him rebelled. A small voice, barely audible, whispered in the back of his mind that it wasn't right to ignore her, that he couldn't just drive past a child in need. The internal conflict gnawed at him, but the pragmatic side of his mind, the side that had kept him alive and employed for 15 years, won out. The decision was made. Instead of slowing down, Orson pressed the accelerator, making a conscious effort to drown out the growing sense of guilt that crept into his chest. The truck roared forward, and he deliberately turned the volume up on the radio, trying to block out the image of the girl and the stirrings of his conscience. The country song that filled the cab was somber, a melancholic tune about lost love and regret, fitting, in a way, for the mood Orson found himself in. As the truck moved past the girl, he couldn't help but glance in his rearview mirror. Her small figure was growing smaller in the distance, but the image of her, trembling and alone, stayed with him. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that it wasn't his problem, that he had done the right thing by not getting involved. But the longer he drove, the more the image of her desperate face haunted him. Her shaking form, her wide eyes, her pleading gesture, all of it seemed to burn itself into his mind. It wasn't just a fleeting memory. It was an accusation, a silent reproach that echoed in his thoughts. As the miles stretched on, Orson felt a deep sense of discomfort. The guilt gnawed at him, growing stronger with every passing minute. The farther he got from the girl, the more it felt like he had made a terrible mistake. "Why didn't I stop?" Orson muttered under his breath, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "What if something happens to her? What if she's out there freezing to death? I could have helped." His voice trailed off, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The snowstorm intensified as the truck barreled down the road, the visibility shrinking to almost nothing. But even as the storm raged outside, Orson's mind was still focused on the girl, her face, her wave, and the deepening sense of guilt that began to suffocate him. His thoughts became a blur of confusion and regret, the road ahead seeming less important with each passing moment. Orson found himself caught in a storm of his own, a storm of conscience that he couldn't outrun. Orson's moment of realization. The truck continued to roll through the night, its engine a constant hum against the backdrop of howling wind and swirling snow. Orson's mind, however, was far from the road ahead. The image of the girl, standing alone on the side of the highway, trembling in her thin pink dress, refused to leave him. It was as if the image had burned itself into his mind, haunting him, gnawing at his conscience with each passing mile. The longer he drove, the more it became clear that ignoring her was no longer an option. Guilt weighed heavily on him, settling in his chest like a brick that grew heavier with each passing moment. He tried to push it aside, trying to rationalize his decision. After all, he had a job to do. The flowers couldn't be late. His boss's orders echoed in his mind, as though he could hear the sharp tone in his boss's voice demanding that he meet the deadline at all costs. "Drive faster," his boss had said earlier, as if Orson could push aside everything else just to meet a simple delivery deadline. "The flowers need to be there on time." Orson's boss's words seemed more like an order from someone who had no concept of what it meant to be human, to have compassion, to understand that some things in life were more important than getting a shipment across the finish line on time. Orson had become numb to the demands over the years, as if he had been stripped of any sense of personal value. The same old pattern day after day had worn him down, driving the truck, hauling loads, delivering goods, while his own life slipped further and further away from him. He had lost his family, his marriage, and his sense of purpose. All he had left was his job, a job that didn't care whether he lived or died, a job that didn't care if he was lonely or depressed. But the girl in the pink dress, had shattered the numbness for the first time in years. Her presence, her vulnerability, had cut through the hardened shell Orson had built around himself. He hadn't even realized how far he had fallen until that moment, until he had seen her waving for help, her body trembling in the cold. The guilt was almost unbearable now. How could he have just driven past her, leaving her out there to face whatever danger awaited her in the storm? He had ignored her, had dismissed her as a potential threat, and in doing so, he had abandoned any shred of decency that still remained inside him. As Orson's truck continued down the road, His eyes fell on the headlights cutting through the snow. The landscape was still desolate, the fields on either side of the highway empty and silent. The thought of continuing down this endless stretch of road, ignoring the girl, seemed more and more wrong. But what could he do? He couldn't just stop in the middle of nowhere. He couldn't risk his job, his livelihood, all for some girl he had never met. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more the realization set in. His life, his work, had come to this. He had spent so many years living for someone else, making deliveries, fulfilling orders, all the while losing himself in the process. The bitter realization hit him hard. He had been living a life without meaning, a life that revolved solely around getting the job done at the cost of everything else. And now, here was a chance to do something right, to help someone in need. "I can't keep living like this," Orson muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "I can't keep ignoring everything that matters." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Orson knew that the path he had been walking, this road of resignation and apathy, wasn't one he wanted to continue down. He had been so focused on surviving, on just getting through each day, that he had forgotten how to live, how to care. The road ahead stretched on, but the more he thought about it, the more Orson knew he had to turn back. He couldn't go on, delivering flowers and produce, ignoring a life in need. He had already crossed the point of no return, and the guilt that weighed on him was more unbearable than any consequence his boss might impose. The right thing to do, the human thing to do, was to turn around and help the girl, no matter what. His hand moved to the steering wheel, and for a moment, he just held it there, as if waiting for something to happen, some sign that he was making the right decision. But deep down, he already knew. The decision had already been made. He had to turn back. Orson took a deep breath, and with a sudden jolt, he swerved the truck onto the shoulder of the highway. The tires skidded on the icy road as he slowed down, turning the wheel sharply, and the truck began to pivot in the opposite direction. The sound of the engine shifting gears seemed almost like a sign, a shift in his life that matched the shift in his mind. He was no longer the same man who had driven past the girl without a second thought. As the truck turned around, Orson's heart began to race. The familiar sight of the road, now behind him, seemed like a distant memory, something he could never go back to. His hands were clammy on the steering wheel, and his mind raced with questions and doubts. What would he find when he returned to the spot where he had seen the girl? Was he too late? Had someone else already found her, or worse, had something happened to her in the time he had spent driving away? The storm outside continued to rage, snow falling harder, the wind picking up. Visibility had dropped further, but Orson pushed forward, determined to make things right. Each passing mile seemed to carry more weight, but as he neared the area where he had seen the girl, a strange sense of urgency filled him. He couldn't be too late. He couldn't live with himself if he didn't at least try. As the truck rounded another bend in the road, Orson squinted through the windshield, hoping to see some sign of the girl. His heart pounded in his chest, his foot tapping nervously on the gas pedal. And then, through the thickening snow, he saw it, a flash of pink against the white landscape. His stomach twisted with a mixture of relief and fear. He wasn't too late. Orson pulled the truck over to the side of the road, his tires crunching through the fresh snow as he parked. He jumped out of the truck, his boots sinking into the deep snow, the cold biting at his exposed skin. He ran toward the girl, his breath visible in the freezing air, his mind focused on nothing but reaching her. He had made a mistake before, but he wouldn't make it again. This time, he would do what was right. The girl's condition and the arrival of Tom. Orson's boots crunched in the snow as he approached the girl, her small frame barely visible against the white expanse that surrounded her. His heart raced in his chest, anxiety pooling in the pit of his stomach. He had to act quickly. The girl had been standing in the snow for an unknown amount of time, and she looked as though she had barely the strength to stand. Orson could see the snow clinging to her dark hair, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she were trying to conserve any warmth she had left. Her face was pale, lips tinged with blue from the cold. The sight made his stomach turn, a sickening sense of guilt flooding over him. How could he have passed her? How could he have justified ignoring her desperate plea for help? It was a question that Orson didn't have an answer to, and one he feared he might never be able to shake off. But he couldn't afford to dwell on that now. The girl needed help, and he was the only one who could give it. As he closed the distance between them, Orson called out softly, his voice gentle, "Hey there, it's okay. You're safe now." The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide and full of fear, a mix of desperation and confusion. She looked like she hadn't spoken to anyone in days, or maybe it was just the shock of the situation that left her so quiet. But Orson wasn't going to let her suffer any longer. He quickly reached for his thermos, unscrewing the cap and offering it to her with a reassuring smile. "Here, take a sip. It's warm." The girl hesitated, her trembling hands barely able to grip the thermos, but Orson encouraged her gently. "It'll help. You need something warm, okay?" The girl's hands shook violently as she took a sip, her small body shivering uncontrollably. Orson could feel the coldness radiating from her as she clutched the thermos, but her lips barely moved as she sipped the warm liquid. She couldn't seem to muster enough strength to do much more than that, her frail frame shaking with each breath. Orson quickly removed his green jacket and draped it over her shoulders, trying to offer her some semblance of warmth, but her body felt almost frozen to the touch. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and began speaking to her softly. "It's going to be okay. I'm going to get you out of here." His voice was more for himself than for her, a mantra of reassurance as he tried to process the situation. His mind raced as he thought about the next steps. Should he call the police? Take her to the nearest station? He knew that this wasn't just a case of a lost child. There was something wrong here, something deeper than just being stranded in the snow. The girl shuddered under the jacket, her small body barely making any sound as she rocked back and forth. Orson knelt beside her, placing a hand on her trembling shoulder. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, trying to coax her into speaking. The girl blinked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and confusion, and she barely shook her head in response. "Are you lost?" Orson asked, his voice filled with concern. She only shook her head again, her lips still not forming any words. Orson pressed on gently, trying to get some form of communication out of her. "Where are your parents? Where's your home?" The girl's eyes darted around, as if looking for someone, and Orson followed her gaze, scanning the empty road behind him. There was no sign of anyone else in sight. The wind howled around them, and the snow continued to fall, a cold blanket that threatened to swallow them whole. The girl's eyes widened as Orson spoke the words, "Call for help," and she suddenly stiffened, pulling back from him with fear in her eyes. Orson was taken aback by her reaction. She looked terrified, her body trembling even harder now as if the mere thought of calling for help filled her with dread. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Sister Haley." "Danger." The words were fragmented, broken, but Orson could make out the terror in her voice. The girl seemed to be trying to tell him something important, something urgent. The fragmented words barely made sense, but they were enough to send a chill through Orson's spine. "Sister? What do you mean?" Orson asked, trying to piece the puzzle together. "Is your sister with you? Where is she?" The girl only stared at him, wide-eyed and shivering, too scared to answer more directly. But there was an unmistakable look of panic in her eyes, and Orson could feel it. Something was wrong, something far more sinister than just a lost child in the snow. Before Orson could continue asking, he heard a sound in the distance, a crunching of snow beneath boots, the unmistakable noise of someone approaching. His body tensed instinctively, and he stood up, positioning himself between the girl and the approaching figure. His eyes scanned the snowy horizon, and as the figure drew closer, Orson felt a knot form in his stomach. A man emerged from the swirling snow, his figure becoming clearer as he got closer. He was dressed in a thick winter coat, a shovel slung over his shoulder. Orson's eyes narrowed as he watched the man's approach. There was something about him that didn't sit right. His expression was dark, almost threatening, but it seemed to shift when he caught sight of Orson and the girl. The moment their eyes met, the expression on his face changed, as if flicking a switch. His scowl melted into a smile, too fast, too unsettling to be genuine. "Well, hello there," the man called out, his voice smooth but edged with something cold. "Thanks for looking out for Belle here. We've been searching everywhere for her." Orson's heart skipped a beat as the man spoke. He didn't like the way the man was looking at the girl, and his words seemed rehearsed, too smooth to be innocent. The girl, Belle, stiffened at the sound of the man's voice. Her body language shifted, and Orson noticed how she clutched tighter onto his jacket, her body shrinking into itself as if she were trying to escape the man's presence. Orson's protective instinct flared as he stood firm, unwilling to let the man get any closer. The man continued, his tone light, but there was an undeniable tension underlying his words. "We live in that farm over yonder," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a distant property in the snowstorm. "It's a cold one today, isn't it? Had to keep all the livestock indoors. Didn't expect to find anyone out here in this weather." Orson couldn't help but feel a sense of unease at the man's words. His voice was too casual, too confident, and the mention of livestock, in particular, didn't sit well with him. Orson kept his eyes locked on the man, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. The man's casual demeanor didn't match the tension in the air. Something in Orson's gut told him that Belle wasn't safe with this man, that whatever had happened here, whatever she was running from, was far more dangerous than it appeared. Belle didn't respond to the man's words. Instead, she shrank further into herself, her eyes avoiding his gaze. Orson knew then that this man wasn't a guardian, he was a threat. The man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Orson could feel the shift in the air, an unspoken challenge between them, a silent warning that the situation was more complicated than it seemed. "Well, we should be getting back," the man said, his voice tightening as he gestured for Belle to follow him. "Thanks again for your help, Mr. Orson." His tone now had a subtle edge, as if warning Orson not to interfere further. Belle didn't move, but the man's grip on her arm tightened, and she flinched in response. Orson watched them, his heart pounding. He didn't trust this man, didn't believe a word that had just come out of his mouth. But there was nothing he could do right now, not without more information. As the man began to lead Belle away, Orson's mind raced, his unease deepening. There was something terribly wrong about this entire situation, and he knew, deep down, that he couldn't let it go. The hidden truth and Myra's escape. As Orson stood there watching Belle and the man disappear into the swirling snow, a sense of dread began to settle deep in his chest. The unease he had felt the moment the man, Tom, approached was only growing stronger. His instincts, honed over years of driving through dangerous and unpredictable situations, told him that something was horribly wrong. There was no mistaking it. The way Belle had recoiled from Tom, the fearful look in her eyes, the way she clutched at Orson's jacket as if trying to escape the man's grasp, everything about this situation was off. Orson watched them disappear into the snowstorm, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to do next. The logical part of his mind told him to keep his distance, to stay out of it, to continue with the deliveries and leave this situation behind. His boss's voice echoed in his mind, demanding that he get the flowers to their destination on time, no matter the cost. But as the image of Belle's frightened face replayed in his mind, Orson couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake by not doing more, by not intervening. As the storm intensified, Orson's mind raced. He had made up his mind to help, but now he wasn't sure where to start. He couldn't just walk away from this, not with Belle in the hands of that man. And as he stood there, trying to process what had just happened, another thought hit him like a jolt to the chest. What if there were more victims? What if Belle wasn't the only one in danger? That was when he heard it, a faint noise in the distance, carried on the wind, almost imperceptible at first but growing louder as it reached him. A soft, desperate sound, like someone calling out for help. Orson's heart skipped a beat. It was coming from somewhere nearby. His eyes scanned the snow-covered landscape, searching for the source of the cry. It sounded like a woman's voice. Without thinking, Orson moved toward the sound, his legs crunching through the snow as he followed the faint cry. The snowstorm had reduced visibility to nearly nothing, but the sound of the voice guided him forward. His footsteps were quick and purposeful, fueled by a growing sense of urgency. The cry led him to a dilapidated chicken coop on the edge of the farm. It was barely visible against the backdrop of the storm, a large, dark structure that seemed to loom in the snow like an ominous shadow. As Orson approached, the sound became clearer, definitely a woman's voice, weak and strained, but unmistakably real. He stopped at the door of the chicken coop, his breath visible in the freezing air, and listened. The cries came again, muffled but full of desperation. Orson's gut told him that he was getting closer to something much bigger than he had anticipated. Whatever was happening here, whatever Belle and this man were running from, it was more sinister than he had thought. Without hesitation, Orson tried the door, but it was locked. He cursed under his breath, realizing that he wasn't going to be able to help the person inside without finding a way in. He quickly scanned the area, looking for something to use. His eyes landed on a rusted metal beam lying against the side of the coop. It looked like it might be heavy enough to break the lock. Orson grabbed the beam, feeling its cold weight in his hands as he approached the lock. His muscles tensed as he swung the beam against the lock, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and fear. The lock resisted at first, but with a final forceful blow, it gave way with a loud crack. Orson quickly yanked open the door, his eyes adjusting to the dim light inside. The sight that met him was horrifying. Huddled in the corner of the coop, surrounded by rusted cages and the squawking of chickens, was a woman. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her skin pale and bruised from what looked like days of neglect. She was covered in dirt and grime, and her eyes were wide with fear as she looked up at Orson. "Please," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible above the noise of the chickens. "Please help me." Orson didn't hesitate. He immediately moved toward her, his heart racing as he crouched beside her. The woman's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope, as if she had been waiting for someone, anyone, to come for her. Orson could see the pain in her eyes, the years of suffering that had led her to this moment. He couldn't imagine what she had been through, but he knew one thing for sure: she needed help. "I'm here to help you," Orson said, his voice calm despite the rush of emotions inside him. He carefully helped her to her feet, supporting her as she stumbled from the cage. The woman winced in pain, clearly weak, but she didn't resist. Her eyes remained fixed on him, full of gratitude and terror. "What's your name?" Orson asked gently, guiding her away from the cages. "Mira," she replied, her voice shaking. "Mira, my daughters, they're gone. My husband took them." Orson's heart sank as the woman's words hit him like a punch. Her eyes welled with tears as she continued, her voice trembling. "My husband, he's not who he seemed. When we moved here after my first husband died, he seemed kind, generous. He promised me he would help run the farm. But then he changed. He took over everything. The farm, our lives, everything. He's a monster now." Orson stood there in stunned silence, the weight of Myra's words sinking in. He had already sensed something was off with Tom, but he hadn't expected this. The man was more than just a manipulative husband. He was a danger to those around him, a man willing to go to any lengths to control and dominate. Myra's voice faltered, and she looked at Orson with wide, fearful eyes. "Please," she whispered, her hands shaking as she grasped at his jacket. "Please help me get them back. My girls, Belle and Haley, they're at the barn. He's taken them there." Orson's heart raced. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had to act. He couldn't let this man continue to hurt these women. He couldn't let Belle and Haley remain in the hands of someone so dangerous. "Don't worry," Orson said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. "We're going to get them out. We'll get them to safety." With no time to waste, Orson helped Mira out of the chicken coop, and together they began to move toward the barn. Orson's mind raced as he thought of the danger ahead. He didn't know exactly what he would find at the barn, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't leaving without those girls. As they moved through the snow, Myra's voice grew quieter, her steps slower as she leaned on Orson for support. "I'm scared," she whispered, her words barely audible above the wind. "I don't know if we can stop him." Orson stopped and looked at her, his expression hardening with resolve. "We will stop him. You're not alone in this. I won't let him hurt anyone else." The barn loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the storm's relentless fury. Orson's heart pounded in his chest, each step taking him closer to the moment he feared and anticipated in equal measure. Mira walked beside him, her steps slow but resolute, her face drawn with fear and exhaustion. She kept glancing back at him, as if looking for reassurance, but Orson knew that there was no easy way out of what was to come. He couldn't protect her from the fear that weighed heavily on her shoulders, nor could he promise her safety until the girls were free. But what he could do was try. And right now, trying was the only option. As they neared the barn, Orson signaled for Mira to stay back, his instincts telling him to approach cautiously. The wind howled around them, but the sounds of children crying broke through the storm, loud and clear, even from a distance. His pulse quickened as he recognized Belle's voice, desperate and fearful, and another voice that could only belong to her sister, Haley. Orson crouched behind a stack of crates, motioning for Mira to do the same. He could hear Tom's heavy footsteps, the scrape of a pitchfork against the barn floor, his voice grumbling in irritation. Orson strained his ears, trying to make sense of the conversation. Tom's voice was clear, filled with malice. "You should have just stayed quiet," he muttered. "You're not leaving here alive if you keep making noise." The words were enough to fuel Orson's anger, but he remained calm, steady. The only thing that mattered now was getting the girls out safely. Orson's mind raced as he formulated a plan. He couldn't just burst in and hope for the best. Tom was armed, and he had a clear advantage. Orson had only one shot at this, and he needed to make it count. His heart raced with adrenaline, his eyes scanning the surroundings. It was dark inside the barn. Only the faint glow of a single light bulb hanging overhead illuminated the chaos below. Belle and Haley were in the center of the barn, Belle lying face down on the dirty floor, her body unmoving. Haley was chained to one of the stalls, her eyes wide with terror. The livestock shuffled nervously around them, the only sound aside from Tom's harsh breathing. Orson's instincts kicked into high gear as he rose from behind the crates. He motioned for Mira to stay put as he took a few cautious steps forward. He had to keep Tom distracted, keep him focused on him and not the girls. As he moved into the barn's entrance, he called out in a calm but firm voice. "Tom," he said, his words laced with a quiet authority. "This ends now." Tom whipped around, his eyes flashing with surprise, then narrowing with fury as he saw Orson standing in the doorway. The pitchfork in his hands shook with rage, the prongs glinting in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come back," Tom snarled, his face twisting with rage. "This is none of your business." "Let them go," Orson said, stepping into the barn fully, his stance wide, ready for whatever came next. "It's over." Tom's grip on the pitchfork tightened. "You think you're the hero now, huh? You should have stayed out of it. You don't know anything about me or what I've been through," he growled. "These girls don't belong to you. They belong to me." Orson took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "What you're doing is wrong, Tom. It's beyond wrong. You're hurting them, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Tom's lip curled into a cruel smile, and with a sudden movement, he jabbed the pitchfork into the ground, the metal scraping loudly against the floor. His voice was cold, filled with venom. "You think I care what you think? You should have kept driving. I warned you, trucker. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into." The air was thick with tension, every word escalating the danger, every moment drawing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. Orson's eyes never left Tom, his muscles tense, ready to react. He needed to get to the girls. He needed to make sure they were safe, but he had to keep Tom distracted just a little longer. "I'm not afraid of you," Orson said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "But you should be afraid of me. Because I'm not leaving without them." Tom's eyes flashed with fury, and with a snarl, he lunged forward, the pitchfork aimed directly at Orson. In an instant, Orson's body moved without thinking. He dove forward, tackling Tom to the ground. The pitchfork flew from Tom's hands, clattering to the floor, but Tom fought back viciously, his fists landing solid punches against Orson's face and chest. Orson could feel the blows, but he kept pushing, using his weight to pin Tom to the floor, determined not to let the man get up. He had to keep him down, to give Mira and the girls the time they needed. The two men struggled on the barn floor, Orson's arms locked around Tom, holding him down with all his strength. Tom's breath was ragged, his body thrashing beneath Orson's, but the truck driver didn't let go. He couldn't. His mind was focused on one thing and one thing only, the safety of Mira and her daughters. "Go. Get them out of here," Orson shouted, his voice strained with the effort of holding Tom down. Mira, who had been watching from the sidelines, didn't hesitate. She rushed to Belle, helping her to her feet, and then moved to Haley, working quickly to unlock the chains that bound her. Orson could hear the sound of the chains rattling, the girls crying out in relief, but he couldn't look. He couldn't take his eyes off Tom. The man's struggles grew more frantic as the sirens of approaching police cars cut through the chaos. He knew it was over, but his mind refused to accept it. He continued to fight, but Orson had the upper hand now. The sound of sirens grew louder, and before Tom could retaliate, the barn door flew open, and a swarm of police officers rushed in, shouting orders. The officers quickly restrained Tom, handcuffing him and pulling him away from Orson. A paramedic rushed to Orson's side, checking his injuries. His body ached, bruises already beginning to form, but he barely felt the pain. His eyes flicked to Mira and the girls as they were wrapped in blankets, their faces pale but filled with relief. "Thank you," Mira said, her voice filled with gratitude as she clutched her daughters close. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Orson nodded, a small, tired smile forming on his lips. "You're safe now," he said softly, though the weight of everything that had happened still lingered heavily in his chest. As the police led Tom away, Orson watched him being hauled into a squad car, his face contorted with rage, but defeated. The nightmare was over. Belle and Haley were safe, and Mira had finally been freed from the grasp of her abusive husband. Orson had done what he had set out to do, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, a part of him felt that he had finally done something that mattered.